Okay, that's a little note there. Good morning. Happy Sabbath. Glad to see everybody here. You know, our numbers are down a little bit this morning, I see, and for a number of reasons, I'm sure. But you know the old saying, it's quality, not quantity, right? So we have the quality here. And if everybody is here, we'd still have the quality here. I don't want to say anything about that. Listen, before we get started, we need to bow our heads in prayer. Okay. Father in heaven, we thank you so much that you are a God of love. You have made every provision for us, Lord. And so we just ask that your Holy Spirit would be with us today, that you'd be with me, that you would be with our folks that are here today, Lord, that your Holy Spirit would speak to each heart and mind, and we ask it all in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, let's turn over here to Romans 14. I just want to read that verse again, and we're going to talk a little bit about Romans 14. It says, receive one who is weak in the faith, but not to dispute over doubtful things. Several weeks ago, the pastor had spoken on liberty, and he quoted some texts here in Romans, and that wasn't his main thrust. He was on liberty. But it got me to thinking, and as I read some of those verses, I got thinking about, there's a lot of denominations in our Christianity, isn't there? And why do you think that is? We have an enemy. Yeah, we do have an enemy, that's for sure. And the people come up with different opinions on things, and we need more than just opinion sometimes, don't we? So I got thinking about it, and so when I went home after the sermon, and I read through Romans 14, and there's some things in there that if we're maybe new to the faith or not really strong in the faith, if we don't have a proper understanding, they might cause us a little bit concern, or it could throw us a little bit. And so I called a couple of friends of mine who are Bible scholars and visited with them. I had some opinions about what Paul is saying here in Romans 14. And as it turned out, I was pretty close, but there was a couple of points that were made to me that helped me a lot with it, and I thought we would talk about that today. First of all, there's 3 rules to Bible interpretation, okay? The first rule is context, right? We have to take it in proper context. The second rule is context. And the third rule, guess what? Is context. Okay? The third rule is context. So, just as an example, let's take a look. Let's turn to Acts 10. Whoops, I'm too far here. Acts, the 10th chapter. And starting with verse 9. Well, I want to give you a background before we start there, though, first. I was a nursing home administrator, and I was running a facility in Midwest City, Oklahoma, which is like Brooklyn is to New York City. Okay, it's all part of the greater metropolitan area. But once a month, we would have the businessmen in Midwest City would have a meeting at the local library there, and they had a nice room there where we could meet. And they'd have a guest speaker that would come in and talk and on various subjects about all kinds of things. And they would provide a lunch for us as well. Now, I happen to, I'm a vegetarian, just happen to be a vegetarian. And so they had, most of what they had there was meats and stuff. And I was standing in line as we're waiting to get our stuff, and they had bread and, sausages and salami and this and that and all kinds of stuff, and I would usually get myself a vegetable plate. But I was standing behind a couple of fellas, and as we got up to the food, one of them turned to the other one side. He says, "Isn't it wonderful that we're under grace?" He says, everything is edible, and so I was tempted to say something, but I don't know why I didn't. I figured this is going to get into a long, drawn-out discussion, and I didn't know if I'd have time to get all the way through it before we were done eating and we needed to get to the meeting we were going to have. But anyways, I didn't say anything, but I probably should have. But this fellow was referring to, let's look at Acts 10, starting with verse 9. The next day as they went on their journey and drew near the city, Peter went up on the housetop to pray about the 6th hour. Then he became very hungry and wanted to eat, but while they made ready, he fell into a trance. In other words, he was having a vision. And saw heaven opened, and an object like a great sheet bound at the four corners, descending to him and let down to the earth. In it were all kinds of four-footed animals of the earth, wild beasts, creeping things, and birds of the air. And a voice came to him, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "Not so, Lord, for I have never eaten anything common or unclean." And a voice spoke to him again the second time, "What God has cleansed, you must not call common." This was done 3 times, and the object was taken up into heaven again. Now while Peter wondered within himself what this vision which he had seen meant, behold, the men who had been sent from Cornelius had made inquiry for Simon's house and stood before the gate. And they called and asked whether Simon, whose surname was Peter, was lodging there. While Peter thought about the vision, the Spirit said to him, "Behold, 3 men are seeking you. And therefore go down and go with them, doubting nothing, for I have sent them." Then Peter went down to the men who had been sent to him from Cornelius and said, "Yes, I am he whom you seek. For what reason have you come?" And they said, "Cornelius the centurion, a just man, one who fears God and has a good reputation among all the nation of the Jews, was divinely instructed by a holy angel to summon you to his house and to hear words from you." Then he invited them in and lodged them. On the next day, Peter went away with them, and some brethren from Joppa accompanied him. Now, what's interesting right here was that, was it, Karen, 6 years ago now, is it? We had a chance to go to Israel, and one day we were staying in Tel Aviv, and that's right on the coast. And we walked down along the coast, and it runs right into what is then Joppa. And we were curious, and we walked around, and we found this house, and it was marked there, and this was Simon the tanner's house, where Peter stayed. And so that was pretty cool. We walked up there and saw the door and everything, and so as I was reading this, I thought it was pretty neat. So he accompanied these men from Joppa and went on. And it says, "And the following day they entered Caesarea. Now Cornelius was waiting for them and had called together his relatives and close friends." Now, in the first part of the reading here, what would that say to you? This sheet comes down with all these animals, and he has this vision here, and God says, don't call common what God has, cleansed, and so on. If you just stopped right there, what would you come up with? You could eat anything you want, right? Does that jive with what the rest of the Bible has to say, though, and what God gave instruction on? No. But, so there's an apparent contradiction. But people who are looking for a reason to do and justify whatever they want to do, stop right there. They don't go any further. But we're going to continue on. Now Cornelius was waiting for them and had called together his relatives and close friends. As Peter was coming in, Cornelius met him and fell down at his feet and worshipped him. But Peter lifted him up, saying, "Stand up, I myself am also a man." And as he talked with him, he went in and found many who had come together. Then he said to them, "You know how unlawful it is for a Jewish man to keep company or go to one another of another nation. But God has shown me that I should not call any man common or unclean." So what was the vision about? It's about people. It wasn't about food at all. The Gentiles were considered unclean. If you went into a Gentile's house, you had to go home then after that and ceremonially clean yourself. Or so the Jews thought. And so, so if we take things out of context, if we don't read the whole thing, we can come up with the wrong impression, can't we? "Therefore I came without objection as soon as I was sent for. I asked then, 'For what reason have you sent for me?' And Cornelius said, 4 days ago I was fasting until this hour, and at the 9th hour I prayed in my house, and behold, a man stood before me in bright clothing, and said, 'Cornelius, your prayer has been heard, and your alms are remembered in the sight of God. Send therefore to Joppa and call Simon here, whose surname is Peter.'" And so on. So it wasn't about food at all, it was about people. We're not to look down on anybody, are we? Yeah. So, with that being said then, let's move on over. Let's go back to Romans then, 14. And I can find it quickly here. Because I'm afraid you guys are going to be egging me or tomatoing me here shortly, because we're running up on time here, but we're going to go through this. It says, in Paul's letter to the church at Rome, chapter 14, 1 through 15, 3, constitutes the section in which the apostle discusses the relationship between weak and strong believers. He warns both groups not to judge each other for at least two reasons. One, because each member lives to the Lord, meaning that he belongs to him, right? That's in 14:8. And two, for we shall stand before the judgment seat of Christ. Rather than judging one another, Paul instructs that everyone should vow not to put a stumbling block or fall in our brother's way. The key text which sums up the apostles' message is 15:1. Let's look at 15:1. It says, "We then, who are strong, ought to bear with the scruples of the weak, and not to please ourselves." And then we could read on from that. "Let each of us please his neighbor for his good, leading to edification." So, we who are strong ought to bear with the scruples of the weak and not to please ourselves. What's that mean? What's that talking about there? This sermon doesn't try to be a traditional commentary on this section of Romans, but rather to outline what the problem in the church was and what it was not in Rome. Okay? There was a problem there. Paul addresses different churches, Corinthians, Galatia, Ephesians, all of those, he writes a letter to those folks. Much speculation exists as to the precise nature of the issue in the Roman church. Unfortunately, that is frequently the case in the New Testament because we only have the apostles' response to the crisis available for us to study. And so you kind of have to figure out the rest by the virtue of what the apostle is addressing there. It says the counseling in this case revolves around two themes: the weak believer who eats only vegetables, okay, 14:2, and 2, the weak believer who esteems one day above another. Now, if we stop there, what kind of a conclusion you're going to come to? Pardon? Each person can make their own decisions. Okay, about eating anything? About what?
Anything.
Yeah.
There's no standard.
Say what?
There's no standard.
Yeah. Don't have any standards, right? Yeah. Okay. So, according to Paul's statement, it's apparent that the dispute had arisen between the two groups of believers. At least some of the weaker members were judging the strong in harsh tones for their lack of conformity to certain practices. Do we ever have that happen in our congregations? No, it never happens, does it? If we're not living up to my understanding of something, then you must be wrong, huh? Okay, so we have to go on and find out further here what's actually being talked about here. They were talking about these certain practices involving food and days, and at least some of the stronger members were despising and otherwise being contemptuous of the weaker. So for their adherence to the same practices. And we find that in 14:3 and 4. Let not him who eats despise him who does not eat, and let him who does not eat judge him who eats, for God has received him. Who are you to judge another's servant? To his own master he stands or falls. Indeed, he will be made to stand, for God is able to make him stand. And so, from this introduction and Paul's emphasis on not using one's Christian liberty to cause a brother to stumble, we may infer that the weaker members were probably in the minority in that church, and they were being criticized. Although there are variants within the first interpretation, there have been essentially three different understandings of the nature of the controversy in the Roman church. And this is where fallout happens and unity in the church starts falling apart. The controversy in the Roman church as follows. The weaker members were primarily Jewish Christians who insisted on adhering to the ceremonial feast days and the laws respecting the distinction between clean and unclean meats given in the Old Testament. One variant of this view is that these days also include the weekly Sabbath. Now I'm going to say here, in my studying, and I think the rest of the study is going to bear it out here, I have two non-negotiables. Okay? The first one is the Sabbath, right? Where is the Sabbath found? Ten Commandments, right in the heart of the Ten Commandments, isn't it? Yeah. And what was the only thing that was put into the Ark of the Covenant? The what? Aaron's rod. But the important thing here is the Ten Commandments, right? And we know at the end of time, there's going to be an issue about the Sabbath. And that's going to stand out. All right? And so that's a non-negotiable. God does not back up on the Sabbath. The Sabbath, so that when we're talking about days here, it's hard for me to believe that God has changed his mind here and instructed Paul to tell them that anything about the Sabbath or that it's a day that is. Yeah. Yeah. We're gonna talk here like this. It says the distinction between clean and unclean meats given in the Old Testament. One variant of this view is that these days also include the weekly Sabbath. Another variant of this view is that the food issue concerns the eating of meat offered to idols and or the eating of clean animals not slaughtered in the proper manner. And so that was something there that they thought maybe was an issue. Two, the weaker members were primarily Gentile Christians. This is the second variant on this, who were still being influenced by their pagan past to view certain days as lucky and others as unlucky, and who accordingly fasted on certain days. A brief aside why it's important to show love when introducing people to Christianity. I want to talk about, Karen alluded to our trip to Peru. It was interesting. We took a tour through this big cathedral and something de la, what was the last name of it there? The what? Franciscan. It was a Franciscan cathedral. I had gone there like 77, 78 and got a personal tour through it. And in the bottom, there's catacombs. In those catacombs, there's all kinds of bones, skulls, arm bones, femurs, all this sort of stuff. Room after room after room filled with bones. And also there, they had a rack there that the conquistadors used to convert Incas to Catholicism. And they put these people on the rack and they would start twisting it, and if they didn't give in pretty quick, they kept on twisting until it pulled their arms out of their sockets and their legs out of the sockets, and they're screaming in agony. And if they finally gave in and said, okay, I believe, they went ahead and finished the job and just killed them so that they couldn't change their mind. Now, does that sound like a very loving way to try to win somebody to Christ? Well, when we went, they had kind of sanitized it down there then, and that rack wasn't out anymore. And certain tunnels down there in the catacombs were blocked off now, and you don't go in there. And I think that's where all the rest of the bones of these poor guys that got just torn apart on these racks. Well, what has developed, and as we took a couple of different tours, and went to Machu Picchu, the lost city of the Incas, and so on, and even at Lake Titicaca. We came down there, and these people, as they talked, and they were talking about the conquistadors, and now they speak Spanish, and so on, it became evident that just under the skin, 500 years later, there's some animosity towards the Spanish for the way they treated and their culture and try to just destroy the culture. And so this part here about how some people might have been falling back in their old pagan ways and so on, well, actually, they came out and said it. On this island that we went to in Lake Titicaca and elsewhere, that they practiced the Catholic religion, but the gods that they pray to and so on, in place of what the different saints and so on that the Catholic Church has, is their Inca gods. So they pretend to be Christian, and they're about half converted on it, but the rest of it, they're still worshiping their Inca gods. And so that was quite interesting. So there's a lesson there about how does Jesus approach us? Humbly. He stands at the door and knocks. And if you see that famous painting, on the outside of the door, there's no doorknob. Jesus can't open the door. We have to open the door of our heart, don't we? And so here we go. It says, of these three different perspectives, the overwhelming option selected by Bible commentators over the years has been the first one. In the next few pages, we evaluate each interpretation and offer our own view of which one is correct. And what I did is I borrowed a lot here from my friend. He spoke here a year ago last September, Dr. Doug Baker, who is a very serious Bible scholar. And so he, after talking with him and getting his point of view on things and found out we were in agreement on most of it there, and then he straightened me out on what I wasn't in agreement on. It made sense. He wrote a paper and sent it to me. And so I have used from that heavily. Those who hold this first view outlined earlier usually link Romans to Galatians 14 to Galatians 4, 8 to 11, Colossians 2, 16 through 17, and or 1 Corinthians 8, 1 through 13, and 10, 19 through 33. In Galatians 4, 8, 11, Paul condemns the observance of days and months and seasons and years. And Colossians 2:16 is linked to Romans 14 because the same apostle there admonishes believers not to judge in food or drink or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbath. Now, in this here, God is not trying to confuse the issue here about, and Paul certainly isn't, about whether or not certain Sabbaths and so on like this. We'll get down to the end here, and I may have to abbreviate. We're going to see that that's not the issue at all. There are serious problems with linking Romans 14 to either Galatians 4 or Colossians 2. First, Paul's harsh tone in both of the latter two chapters is entirely absent in Romans 14. In Galatians, Paul despairs of his possibly having labored in vain for them because these people were falling back into their old pagan ways. That's vastly different than what's going on in Romans 14. They're having disputes over, he says, not to dispute over doubtful things. Okay, so what that tells us is that this is not over doctrinal issues. These things that they're having contention over are not over doctrinal issues. These are over things that are pretty minor, really. And so, and he was also, because it says there, because they were being bewitched, these people in Galatians, by false teachers preaching another gospel, which is a perversion of the true gospel of Christ. Moreover, the heresy there represented as a turn again to those which by nature are not gods. In other words, going back to their pagan gods. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. Which is an explicit reference to the paganism of their former ways. And in Colossians, the false teachers are cheating the believers through a substitution of philosophy and empty deceit according to the tradition of men, according to the basic principles of the world, and not according to Christ. And this is in Colossians 2:18. And if you'd like to write these texts down and go and check this stuff out for yourself, because I've got like 14 pages of stuff here, and I'm not going to be able to get through all this. Yeah, we're going to be here till late. It's very, very interesting, though. For Christ himself, this substitutionary philosophy was decidedly ascetic in nature and thus far beyond anything required by the Old Testament. Whatever the precise nature of the problems in Galatia and Colossae, clear references to pagan influences in both places represent a sharp contrast to the situation at Rome. Again, this is not the situation at Rome. They're not falling back on old pagan practices or anything like that. That's not what's going on. For that reason, Paul is downright gentle towards the weaker members in Rome, telling all the believers to respect one another despite their differences on these matters. Therefore, the difference in Paul's tone and in the theological content of the heresies requires a recognition that the problems in Rome were very different from those in Galatia and Colossae. And so, what it boils down to is that let's go on to some of the Sabbath stuff here. Some commentators deny that either the seventh-day Sabbath or Sunday is included in the discussion of days in Romans 14, while others include the seventh-day Sabbath as part of the Mosaic law or ceremonial days that they insist are included in the chapter. We give reasons in subsequent paragraphs that no part of the Mosaic law is under discussion in this chapter. And the evidence is back here in 14:1. Not to dispute over doubtful things. There's nothing doubtful about the doctrines that the church in the Jews and the stuff that they were given, and then certainly when Christ came and the things that he taught, and now Paul is bringing in all these folks around Asia Minor and preaching to them that has nothing to do with the Mosaic law. But just for the sake of argument, we suppose that it is. Paul would be saying that it was only the weaker believers who kept the Sabbath. Yet in Romans 15:1, the apostle identifies himself with the strong believers, and the book of Acts is quite clear that he kept the Sabbath. Therefore, critics of the weekly Sabbath would have Paul contradicting himself by telling Christians in Rome that only weak believers keep the Sabbath, but that he himself, a strong Christian, kept it. You see the problem there? It doesn't make sense, does it? So it's not about the Sabbath, okay? Concerning the principal paradigm of this first view, that the Mosaic law with its annual feast days, weekly Sabbath, and distinction between and unclean meats is the point of discussion. Several pieces of evidence mitigate against it. First, Romans 14:1 begins the discussion by announcing that the dispute in Rome was over doubtful things, which I brought out. This alone suggests that the entire discussion which follows is not about an issue of law keeping versus freedom from law keeping. Furthermore, when Paul speaks of God's law and the Christian's relationship to it, he uses certain key words such as law, grace, letter, versus, and spirit. But none of those or other related terms appear anywhere in this section of his letter. So Paul is not talking about doctrinal things here. Second, the reference to days in the context of the discussion on food and drink. Indeed, Paul explicitly mentions words referring to food and drink on the act of eating and drinking in 9 different verses, while he devotes less than 2 full verses to days. And so he would have been putting the big emphasis on food and very little on days. Well, don't you think the Sabbath would be a pretty important thing you devote more than 2 verses to, if that was really what he was talking about? This strongly suggests that what one decides about the discussion of diet versus vis-a-vis the Mosaic law should determine whether the issue of the days has anything to do with the Mosaic law. And what we discover is that the dietary practice of vegetarianism has no basis in the Mosaic law or anywhere else in the Old Testament. Although vegetarianism is a wise health habit for anyone in the modern world with increased natural diseases in animals and the prevailing use of antibiotics and unnatural feed given to them, it is nowhere commanded in Scripture whether inside or outside the Mosaic law. Moreover, the Greek word for wine in this chapter, verse 21, is a generic word used for both fermented and unfermented grape juice, just as the English word wine was first used. Only those who voluntarily took the special vow of the Nazirite were prohibited from eating the grape or drinking its juice in either its fermented or unfermented state. So, beyond this evidence is the fact that the Greek word for unclean, which appears 3 times in Romans 14, is not the same word used in the Septuagint of Leviticus or Deuteronomy in connection with the distinction between clean and unclean meats. Instead, it is a word that primarily denotes that which is common to everyone. While this same word is used in Acts 10:14 and 11:8 in close association to the normal word for unclean when discussing food in Romans 14, the context is vegetarianism versus carnivorism, not clean and unclean meats. This implies that the food is ordinarily acceptable, but that it has become, for some people, unacceptable for some external reason, by being offered to idols by virtue of a particular feast or fast day, or by its association with some astrological day. Okay? And that's why there was nothing wrong with the food. And so if somebody was eating it and a weaker one saw them eating it, Paul doesn't want them, he's admonishing us not to throw a stumbling block in front of somebody who's maybe a babe in the Word, who's somebody who is just doesn't understand all of this stuff yet, and we need to be careful about what we do, even though there's nothing wrong with doing it. There was nothing wrong with eating that food, okay? But if it causes a stumbling block to somebody else, we have an obligation to try to think of them rather than ourselves. And I'm going to sum this up here so that the conclusion here says the church in Rome experienced a controversy whom Paul called weak and strong members that apparently represented a sufficient threat to its unity that the people devoted one section of his letter, that the apostle devoted one section of his letter to it. The precise nature of this conflict has been the subject of debate among Christian thinkers for centuries, and so there's different views on that. But what it boils down to, the largest percentage of Bible scholars by far subscribes to some version of the first view, because other letters by Paul also speak about the observance of days, Galatians 4, Colossians 2, and one of those even associates this idea with food. It's in Colossians 2. However, when these 2 chapters are carefully analyzed, we find that both the context and Paul's attitude are very different from what they are in Romans 14. Galatians 4 and Colossians 2 contain elements of an astrological and or pagan nature, which is entirely absent in Romans 14. Moreover, Paul is quite emphatic and even harsh in those other two chapters, whereas he is subdued and gentle in Romans 14. Therefore, in order to adopt the first view, one has to ignore those significant differences and simply conclude that the topic of days and or food provide a sufficient parallel to Romans 14 to adopt the first view. We understand why many scholars do that, but we think that when one analyzes all the data, the view that the conflict was over, which days are preferable for fasting from meat and wine, is a much more satisfying conclusion. And says Paul's counsel placed the concepts of Christian liberty and love into balance. He did agree with the strong members that it made no difference what day a believer chose to fast, and identified himself as strong. So the a matter about days was simply about which days should we fast on. It had nothing to do with what day should we worship on. All right? In other words, Christian liberty means that each believer has the right to decide such personal opinions for himself. At the same time, Christian love requires that the weak members respect the same liberty for the strong members, and the strong members to live and let live on the issue. It is evident that the apostle adopted his attitude because the controversy had nothing to do with Christian doctrine. Neither did the practice of the weak members undermine the authority of the church, nor lead anyone else spiritually astray. It did, however, undermine church unity. And that's what we need to be careful of. Sometimes you'll hear people, and they're on a bandwagon about something, and it's not a doctrinal issue, but they'll make a big deal about it and get other people upset when we shouldn't be doing that. That's what Paul is saying here. Therefore, Paul's counsel was to keep the peace and leave every member free to decide the issue for himself. The spiritual lesson for all Christians in all places and all times is simply this: if anyone's position within the church does not affect the purity of a doctrine, undermine the authority of the church, or lead anyone else spiritually astray, then neither perspective on the matter should push their own personal opinion on anyone else. Okay? Christian liberty and Christian love demand such an attitude. Okay? That's what it's about. Okay? All right. Let's close with our closing hymn. Which I need to get my bulletin and look to see which one it is. 321.